You may recall that I said a few days ago that the Republican Party in the House of Representatives might just do something good for Congress and the American people. Well, I spoke too soon and it didn't work out. But before we unpack all that, if you haven't yet, please hit that like, subscribe, and the alert bell. All right, folks, when I mentioned that the other day, I was referring to the potential expulsion from the House of Representatives of Representative George Santos, the freshman Republican congressman from Long Island and the pathologically lying fraud, who I think is currently under federal indictment for 23 different counts of crime. Right? Well, it turns out they did try to expel him, and it failed. The effort failed. You needed a two-thirds majority of the House of Representatives, and even though Republicans had been teasing that they were pretty sure they'd get that two-thirds majority, they failed to do so. So the final vote was 213 voted no, 179 voted yes, 19 voted present. Now, as a reminder, what made this particular attempt to expel George Santos interesting is was actually brought by his fellow Republicans. As a matter of fact, his fellow Republicans from New York, they brought this particular motion. Democrats attempted to do this back in May, and all the Republicans essentially blocked it and voted to get it shifted to the Internal Ethics Committee, and the investigation is still ongoing. But now, for whatever reason, those same Republicans are like, actually, you know what, we do want to kick him. And we'll get to that in a minute. But this is what George Santos had to say at the time.
That one is presumed innocent until proven guilty. It is unconscionable to think that this body, who is at war with the DOJ over their politically motivated practices, would blindly accept their accusation against a member of another branch of government.
So what's interesting about this, and this came from the night, it was yesterday evening, that Republicans again attempted to expel George Santos, and those were his words from last night. And even though he's a pathologically lying fraud and a terrible person, he does make an interesting point. Pretty much every Republican, every elected Republican has taken the position that President Biden's Department of Justice is weaponized against them, that it's politically motivated. And so George Santos makes the point that, okay, if that's true, then why are you taking the DOJ at their word? Now, the reason I think that hypocrisy is interesting, because, of course, it reveals that Republicans don't actually believe the Department of Justice has been weaponized. They're saying that to feed into their base, but clearly they trust the Department of Justice for the most part. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense to try to expel George Santos primarily because of these indictments from the Department of Justice. You see what I'm saying? But this is Michael Lawler, presumably a nominally centrist Republican who was also from New York and one of the co-sponsors of this legislation. We're not going to play this whole clip because it's about 2 minutes and we have other clips to play. But this is what he said the same day as he tried to rally votes for the resolution to expel Santos.
And based on the conviction and guilty plea of his treasurer and the admission of the fraud that was perpetrated upon donors, upon the NRCC, upon former Speaker McCarthy's chief of staff, that is more than sufficient evidence and information to expel Mr. Santos from Congress. There is not enough time to go through the litany of lies that Mr. Santos has engaged in during his campaign and during his time in Congress.
Now, again, all that's true, but noticing, so what they're saying in response is, okay, listen, maybe we don't have to rely on the Department of Justice's indictments against you. We can just refer to the criminal behavior of people close to you in your orbit. And again, perhaps that's true, but it's just interesting how that's a sufficient basis by which to expel George Santos from Congress. And then you cite his dishonesty. Well, Donald Trump is a pathological liar par excellence, and you have all sworn fealty to him. So it's interesting, again, how the standards shift. You can tell it's that Republicans are at war with their own conscience, or maybe not their own conscience. Maybe it's actually an optics issue, as somebody else goes to make the case. This is Democratic Congressman Dan Goldman. And it's interesting how he gets brought into this. So pay attention.
Mr. Santos is recognized. Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities toward the president.
Mr. Chair, I yield 5 minutes to my colleague from New York, Mr. Goldman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Santos. Thank you.
That's right. George Santos just yielded time to a Democratic congressperson. Okay, he gave his time to allow Dan Goldman to talk. And this is what Dan Goldman has to say.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of this resolution to expel George Santos from Congress, as I did in May when I co-sponsored a similar expulsion resolution that the sponsors of today's resolution, my Republican colleagues from New York, did not support. I agree with everything that my Republican colleagues have said here today, but everything they have said here today was also true in May when they voted to protect George Santos. Has there been anything that has changed? Nothing about the numerous lies that Mr. Santos admitted himself to making in order to deceive his voters into electing him. Nothing about his status as an indicted criminal defendant. Yes, there has been a superseding indictment with more allegations of criminal conduct, but he is still presumed innocent until proven guilty, as my New York friends relied upon in May when they voted to protect George Santos from expulsion.
So you see how that works? Basically, even though the Republicans are right to try to get George Santos expelled, their arguments for doing so now as opposed to May, none of them bear scrutiny, because as Dan Goldman points out, nothing has changed materially. The lies that you accuse him of making now and that he's admitted to making, he made back in May when you opposed his expulsion then. There were, yes, a superseding indictment of additional charges, but he's presumed innocent even under those charges, and you said he was presumed innocent under the original charges back in May too. So there has to be something else. Either you've changed your mind, in which case you should apologize and admit to it. You know what? We were actually wrong when we protected him in May. Either our values changed, our principles changed, or it was just politically expedient, or we were just being contrarian to oppose the Democrats. But we were wrong, or you can admit that there's actually a political consequence that you fear. Now, people were wondering, I remember I was when I saw this clip, I'm like, why would George Santos allow Dan Goldman to speak? Now, granted, he spent much of his time criticizing the other Republicans, and it turns out that that's the reason why. Goldman asked George Santos to yield floor time to him, but was denied, the New York Republicans, right? So then he turns to Santos, who agreed to try, as according to this reporter, a poke in the eye to the New York Republicans. So Santos yielded time to Goldman, knowing that Goldman despises him and wants him kicked out of Congress and supports the resolution, but just to throw shade at the opposition. And to be perfectly candid with you, I'm glad that Goldman took the opportunity. I know a lot of people would say, why just look a gift horse in the mouth? Just go along with it. No, I think that the way our current politics are, Democrats actually have to get a bit feistier, a bit more ruthless, even when they're willing to partner with Republicans. Because the problem is, Republicans do that all the time with us. And Democrats indulge in civility politics far too often. And I think you should when it is useful. When it is useful. And when it's not useful, I think it's okay to do what Goldman did, which say, listen, I want to back your resolution, but I also want to take floor time with a camera on me to point out that you guys are losers and hypocrites, because the basis for your resolution today was the same basis for the Democrats' resolution in May, and you cowardly protected Santos then, and now you're trying to kick him out now. I just want the American people to know that you're pathetic and you're losers. I think it's okay to point that out. But ultimately, again, the resolution failed. He was supposed to get a 2/3 majority in order to kick him out. Democrats and those New York Republicans failed to do so. And actually, one of the surprising votes to protect Santos came from one of my favorite Democratic congresspeople. Congressman Jamie Raskin voted to protect George Santos. And I was shocked. And then I read his response. I'll read it to you, and let's unpack it. He says, I'm a Constitution guy. The House has expelled 5 people in our history, 3 for joining the Confederacy as traitors to the Union, and 2 after they were convicted of criminal offenses. Santos has not been criminally convicted yet of the offenses cited in the resolution, nor has he been found guilty of ethics offenses in the House internal process. This would be a terrible precedent to set, expelling people who have not been convicted of a crime and without internal due process. If and when Santos is convicted of these serious criminal offenses or ethics charges, I will certainly vote to expel. Until then, it's a very risky road to go down, and we have to stick by due process and the rule of law, as obvious as the eventual result seems. I can think of 4 or 5 Democratic members the Republicans would like to expel without conviction or adverse ethics findings. We can't abandon due process and the rule of law in the House of Representatives. All of that sounds eminently reasonable on paper, and Jamie Raskin is an eminently reasonable guy. But I'm not sure I agree with this, because the fact of the matter is, it seems to me at the very end, he's basically making the case that, listen, I'm a due process guy, but even if I wanted to, even if I take the position that George Santos's admitted lies and fraud, and you don't need an investigation, you don't need a conviction, he's openly admitted it, that he's lied about large swaths of his biography. Even if I found that to be a sufficient basis to expel him, I don't want to set the precedent that will allow Republicans to expel Democrats that they don't like. But here are two problems with that. Number one, you don't need to set the precedent. This isn't a turn-based RPG, Congressman, with all due respect. It's not like in order for them to do something, you have to do something first. They can take the initiative whenever they damn well please if they have the numbers, right? If they have the votes to make it happen. And that gets us to the second objection, or my second objection to Jamie Raskin's logic here. They would still need a two-thirds majority to do it. Republicans would need a two-thirds majority to expel any of the 4 or 5 Democrats that you mentioned. And they don't have those numbers. They could never get those numbers. So I think you're safe. So I don't know why, but it could very well be. There could be the idea that George Santos is, as Dan Goldman would eventually say in the comments, and we're not going to play the clip because otherwise, again, we'll be here forever. He says that, George Santos is an albatross around the neck of the Republican Party because he's so wildly unpopular. 80% of his own constituents want him to resign. And so perhaps Jamie Raskin is like, no, we're just going to allow this to hang around the necks of Republicans as we head into an election year. Maybe it's a political calculation that Congressman Raskin is making, in which case, fair enough. But I reject the argument that he offered. I don't think you voting to expel Santos is going to magically open the door for Republicans to behave badly or behave in bad faith, because they never needed that door open in the first place. They can do it whenever they damn well please, as they've proven time and time and time again. But number two, even if they did want to expel Democrats, they would need a two-thirds majority, and it's incredibly unlikely they would get that. That's my position. The last thing I'll point out is apparently George Santos, after the motion failed, he shared this meme. Tonight was a victory for due process, not me. This was never about me, and I'll never let it become about me. And then he shared a meme making it about him with a crown. If you come for me, you best not miss. But apparently he rapidly deleted it. Let me know what you think of all this in the comments section. I'd like your feedback.